Welcome to Stepping into Shakespeare presents Shakespeare in Film, a podcast looking at how the world's best Shakespeare plays were turned into the world's best films. Today we have the great pleasure of interviewing producer Colin Vaines, who produced the Shakespeare film Coriolanus, which was directed and starred Ralph Fiennes. Some of the films that he's produced include Gangs of New York, Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool, The Young Victoria, and The Rum Diary. Colin, thank you so much for being here today.
Lovely to be with you and lovely to be on it and lovely to talk about this film, which means a lot to me.
It's an amazing film and it's really great, but I'm sure, it's just such a challenge probably to get it to where it needed to be.
The fact that it exists is quite miraculous in a lot of ways.
Could you talk a little bit about how the film came about?
Of course. So it came about because Ralph Fiennes had played Coriolanus in London. He'd done a fairly sort of I would say fairly conventional production, but it was a kind of very successful one. It was one of those ones that he got off the ground. Ralph got into this thing of doing Shakespeare in unusual places, like he did Hamlet at the Hackney Empire, which was like a big event rather than one of the sort of the mainstream theatres in London. And he did Coriolanus with another play. I can't remember which other Shakespeare he did, but he'd done it in another one of these sort of warehouse settings or something like that. And he'd always been really interested in, he loved the play, but he was also interested in how you would do it as a film, because it was obviously one of the Shakespeares that hadn't been filmed, because obviously when people go for film Shakespeares, they tend to go for something that they feel is more easily sellable or palatable, like the Macbeths that get done and so on, and the Hamlets that get done. And he had, I believe, he started it by basically commissioning John Logan, very, very fine writer who has done everything from Skyfall. Later on, he did some of the Bonds. He's a very good playwright. He'd written some really fine TV films as well. He worked on Gladiator. So extremely fine screenwriter who also was a very successful playwright too. And they worked together on a version of Coriolanus, which was a contemporary version of the play. And people have very, very mixed feelings about contemporary productions of Shakespeare. I think that there's often, I don't know, there's just many, many opinions about what works best and so on. You do face a very peculiar thing when you try and do this as a film, where almost the first thing that people say is, well, if it's contemporary, why don't you change the language? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of so self-defeating. And of course, there are some versions of Shakespeare or that are inspired by Shakespeare, which have been done as contemporary things. There was that film, The King, a few years ago with Timothée Chalamet, which was basically Henry IV, but done in contemporary language. Didn't work for me at all. I thought it was neither fish nor fowl. But clearly, I think that the brilliance of Shakespeare is the language is so brilliant and so beautiful and so amazing and extraordinary. His psychological insights are so extraordinary and interesting, and they're utterly timeless.
Yes.
So the great versions of Shakespeare on film, like the Baslam and Romeo and Juliet, which I think is a masterpiece in its own way, these kind of films, the Michael Almereyda Hamlet, which is really extraordinary, I think, and does something very special. So Ralph and John's script, relocated it to the Balkans and made it something that obviously had resonances that you felt, even though it was unspecified, because it was Rome, but it was not Rome. And that was something that we sort of felt that we had to address with the opening of the film. But anyway, they'd written a script together, and it was very dynamic and interesting, and obviously cut the play substantially because it's an extremely long play. But they took it out, and, CAA, who represented Ralph, were kind of taking it out and looking for financiers, looking for backers. And it was very challenging because however much people loved Ralph, they felt like this was a really difficult project to sell, widely. So it started out, it was picked up by a producer, an American producer who had quite a successful company. and it was budgeted with very high-end heads of department and so on at $15 million. And it was floating around for quite a long time, but it never got enough money. It didn't pick up a distributor. No, they couldn't find someone interested in taking it on. And at $15 million, it was considered a very risky project. So although Rafe had gone off and had done recce's and looked at places and tried to just, figure out how to make it, at that budget level, it was very challenging. And he then started working that two producers came on board, Julia Taylor Stanley and Gabby Tanner, and that they together was trying to see what was possible, with the project at that kind of production budget. And it was still proving very, very difficult to do. So it got to a point where I basically took Rafe out of the Royal Shakespeare Company to make the very first thing that he did. The very, very, very first thing he did was an afternoon's work on a TV show called Prime Suspect. And he's in one scene in that. But other than that, all his work was on the stage. I developed this was in 2000, when was it? Gosh, 1991, that I was working with David Putnam, and he wanted to do a project about T. Lawrence. And David's idea was he wanted to make the sort of the soup to nuts version, as they would say, of Lawrence's life, which now no one would blink an eye at. But in 1990, as a TV project, it was considered quite challenging. And an associate of David's, called Clive Irving, who's a brilliant journalist, said, why don't you do the microcosm? Why don't you just take one tiny, tiny bit of Lawrence's life that is indicative of everything and see if you can make something out of that? So I developed for David a script about Lawrence at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, which is a very interesting moment in time for him, because he was coming out of the desert. He was creating the myth of Lawrence of Arabia by writing the story of it himself in this kind of self-mythologizing book. And there was also a show about him that was touring around London, and it went to America, where Lawrence, it was done by a journalist called Lowell Thomas, and originally it was a show about the war at the time of the First World War, what was happening in the desert, and Lawrence was a minor part of it, but he captured the public imagination, and the show became to be entirely about Lawrence in Arabia. So that was happening at this time, and he tried very hard, Lawrence, to get Faisal onto the throne of Syria. That's what had been promised to Faisal if he fought with the British against the Ottomans, who were allies of the Germans. And he went to the Paris Peace Conference to plead the case for Faisal to be put on the throne, not knowing that, in fact, the French and the English had divided Arabia up already and decided who was going to take what. And the British wanted the Persian Gulf because they knew that there was oil there, whereas Syria they didn't care about. So basically, Faisal was betrayed. And it's a rather sad story. That's a story set in 1919, but a very contemporary story. Anyway, I was advised to go and see Rafe at the Royal Shakespeare Company in 3 shows that he was in, and I thought he was absolutely astonishing. And I approached him about playing the part of T. Lawrence, and he'd only ever done this afternoon's work on Prime Suspect, but it was so brilliant on stage, you could just tell that he was going to be extraordinary. And then it turned out by fate that the first director I had on it dropped out, but the second director was the same guy who directed him in this episode of Prime Suspect.
Oh, weird.
It was kind of like fate that this thing happened. So he felt very comfortable working with the director he'd worked with before for his first show. So we did the show, and it was a disaster in England, but hugely successful in America, and it won an Emmy, and it launched Rafe's career. Just after it was broadcast, he got asked to do Schindler's List. So he got that was what propelled him forward. So I'd known Rafe since that time, 1990 or whatever. We'd been very close at the time. So fade and dissolve to 2010. And I was just leaving working with a producer called Graham King, who I'd been working with for a couple of years in LA. And Rafe called me up one day and he said, look, we've got kind of stuck on the project. That I love Gabby and Julia, but the project's not moving forward. Do you think you could get involved and maybe you can help to unstick it? So essentially, all I really did was cut the budget in half, the first thing I said is, you're never going to make this film for 15 million. It's lunacy. So let's try and make it for like 7 million or something like that. I then brought in a brilliant line producer who was very, very good at figuring out how to do things for a lot less money. Gabby Tanner, her father is the restaurateur called Dan Tanner.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Dan is a kind of he left Yugoslavia as it then was. He defected from Yugoslavia when he was a young man and set himself up eventually in America and became very successful. But once Yugoslavia was split up into its composite parts, he's a Serbian and he was treated like royalty in Serbia. So essentially, Gabby said, "Let's shoot in Serbia because she didn't say my dad has a lot of great contacts here, but that was the case." So although there wasn't a tax credit, which would have been helpful if we'd shot in, say, Hungary,
Mm.
we got incredible cooperation from the Serbians. So between me coming in and bringing in a line producer and being quite brutal, cutting the budget in half and saying, you can't have this production designer because they cost too much. You can't have this costume designer, they cost too much. You can't do this, you can't do that. But we found a way to cut the budget substantially. We had a brilliant we had Kevin, who was a brilliant producer for that part of the world, and we had a wonderful O-line producer there who was very, very good at kind of pulling the stuff together. And we had, effectively what the Serbians gave us was they gave us 2 platoons of the military police, and they became the Romans and the Volscians, the 2 warring factions in the film. They also gave us tanks and military vehicles, which were incredible, and they gave us the use of the Senate building. So I reckon we probably had something close to 2 million in production value
Amazing.
added to the film through these things. But of course, this was further down the line. So when I joined, they were still trying to raise the money, and essentially, Julia, the other producer, was very, very good on things like tax credits and those kind of areas. She was very good in getting that getting that underway for doing the post production. We were able to use that. Gabby was brilliant at bringing in the Serbian elements that gave us additional value for money, and she found a couple of producers who took a chance in Serbia. Now, it was still a risk. And I think for this company, it was more of a sense that this is something that would be prestigious for them and hopefully they wouldn't lose their shirts. But no one went into it thinking there was going to be a lot of money on this thing. And some of it just came down to we went to the 2 critical ones for the UK. We went to the BBC, who initially turned it down, which we were a bit astounded by. But we went in and we brought Rafe in as full on Hollywood star, sitting there talking about it, and we got the money. So
That's brilliant.
they changed their mind after full on charisma driven performance by the main guy, who is going into this thing to star in it, as work very closely on the adaptation, is one of the producers on it and so on. So we got the BBC and the other company that were involved. We went to Lionsgate, which was run by Ziggy Kamasa, and Nick Manzi was his sort of right hand, and they've now resurfaced in a company called True Brit. But basically, Lionsgate is a big American company, but they had a UK division, and they like to do quality British films, and this just ticked the boxes for them. So again, neither the BBC or Lionsgate gave us a lot of money, but they gave us enough money with the Serbian money we had to get us over the line, and this additional factor of the budget being cut, which Rafe had embraced fully because he wanted to get it made. So we worked with, wouldn't say very good people, but not the people that he was initially planning to work with. He would like maybe 2-3 times as much, really, really high-end people. We got really inventive people involved with it. And on top of all of that, Rafe basically put all of his fees into the film. So he didn't actually take any money out. All the money that was in for him as star and director and producer, he just put back into the film.
Wow.
And in fact, we didn't take out full fees, not that they were very high, but it was a film that was made out of an incredible sense of commitment and a feeling that we could do something really special about it.
Yeah, you definitely did. I mean, it's amazing. And you just, as an audience member, you just buy into, I don't know how exactly, but you buy into the Rome thing and then the contemporary, and it just all worked, you know, even though it was probably like you said, doing a modern adaptation. It was just, you just accept it and you're like, yeah, this is it. This is
Well, it's lovely to say it, because I felt that we actually made a deal with John Osborne's estate, the playwright John Osborne. John Osborne had written a kind of contemporary with contemporary language version of the story called A Place Calling Itself Rome, and we thought that was such a great thing to have. So in the concept of the film, we established that there is a television station which kind that one of the on stage characters that's like a narrator or with things became a newscaster. And so we'd established that idea. And so we opened the film with newsreel footage of the country falling apart, all the things that you know in the play of Coriolanus, that there's food shortages, the people are rising up, that they send the leaders use Gaius Marcius, who becomes Coriolanus, as the kind of this really tough guy that puts the people in their places and their protests. So it fed into, of course, in 2010, we were feeding into what had happened in the last 10 or 20 years in Eastern Europe, and the battles that had taken place. So there was a lot of newsreel footage we could have of uprest and so on that could be used. And we used that right at the start of the film, and this caption on it that came over it that said, "A place calling itself Rome." So you kind of prepped people, yes, for the fact that they were going to get that. You always have that moment in contemporary, if you shoot Shakespeare in a contemporary setting, where the first time people say something, it's a little bit like, oh, right.
yeah.
And I would say we have a minor issue, if I'm being critical of the film. Well, maybe it's not really being critical, but Rafe did something beautiful, which is he didn't want the film to be just full of white middle class thesps, that he wanted to get away from that. And he'd worked with a really interesting Palestinian actor when he did Clash of the Titans. And he went to him and said, "I'd like you to be in the film as one of the, one of the protesters, important part." And he went to a brilliant, and he went to a brilliant Lebanese actress as well. But it did mean that the first lines in the film that we hear are spoken by actors who English is not their first language. And that was a little challenging, because it did mean that we had to really work on that. We had to do versions where they delivered the line at different paces to see what would be understandable. And we did do some work in post on all of that stuff. But in general, I think once you're there, you really understand it. And the film is on this very visceral level. And of course, Gaius Marcius's first appearance, when they're protesting outside the factory again and demanding bread and so on, and he appears and he's fucking terrifying. So he's a really scary sort of presence. And of course, he's a brilliant verse speaker. And one of the things that we wanted to do, because Rafe and I were really obsessive about the verse speaking. So the one thing that we did, which was outside the budget of the film, but Rafe paid for out of his own pocket, was to employ Joan Washington, the late, great, magnificent Joan Washington, one of the most amazing people I've ever worked with in my life. I worked with her on quite a few films as a dialect coach. And basically she and probably Patsy Roddenberry are, in Britain, were the two greatest instructors, I would say, of contemporary Shakespearean verse speaking. So to get away, because there is, for example, there's a version of Coriolanus online, which is from the 70s he was a great actor, Alan Howard, but it's very much the kind of and you look at this stuff now and it looks like it's out of the ark. You kind of go, no,
Yeah.
you can't do that. And Joan was magnificent at just making it sound so natural, making it sound conversational, and all those obvious things that we know, like don't stop on the end of the verse at line, but make sure you do carry on to the next, the next thing. Just things, don't, let your voice rise, which it's sort of naturally, there's an instinct to do those things. So that was she was on the film paid for by Rafe, but
Amazing.
I think she was an incredible, like, the film would not be the film it is. I remember one day very specifically coming in, and they were great actors. They were really wonderful people. He cast, originally, he'd cast William Hurt, great actor, to play Menenius, and then William Hurt wasn't available, so he went to Brian Cox, who, of course, is now everybody loves Brian Cox, and
Yeah.
he's magnificent. At the time, he didn't have that Succession profile or whatever. He was just an actor's actor, and my God, it was amazing having him. And then Vanessa Redgrave played his mother.
Oh, amazing. Wow. She was just,
She's stunning. Well,
yeah.
there's a story behind that as well. But Jessica Chastain, who had made at this point something like 5 films, and none of them had been released, and nobody knew who she was. But Rafe had seen her on Broadway and had said, "I'm going to do this film with you, whatever." And it's the same with Vanessa. She'd been on standby for like 5 years to make the film as well.
Oh, wow.
So, and then we had other people, like there was, I can't remember, that we got again from one of the Tribunes right at the last minute. The actor that was going to do it couldn't do it, and we went to Jimmy Nesbitt, who of course was mostly associated with kind of comedy and so on at the time from British TV, but he had done things like Omar, brilliant Paul Greengrass film, and he's a really, really fine actor. And of course, he was tickled to bits to be doing something like that. But I remember one morning going in to watch the scene when they're having a meeting in a cafe, and the 2 Tribunes are watching television and commenting on it, and Brian Cox hears them, and he starts, as Menenius hears them, comes over and starts talking to them. And I remember the rehearsal and having that moment of going, I love Shakespeare, but I can't understand anything that these people have been saying for the last 10 minutes, because I'm just, my ear is sort of attuned, or the language isn't right. And an hour with Joan Washington, you came back and you said, well, I don't understand what my problem was, because she was so magnificent at
Mhm.
guiding the rhythms of the language, and the points where it needs to be sort of struck or whatever were really extraordinary things. So that all of these actors were lined up. So we had this limited budget, and we knew we were going to go to Serbia. Oh, so a big part of the finance package came through a tax credit scheme. This was a big part of what Julia did in pulling it together. That there was one of these schemes which eventually became very difficult to put into practice. The revenue started to crack down on them quite severely, and it was a company that was run by a wonderful man called Chris Figgs, and they basically washed people's tax money to make a film, which is how these schemes kind of worked. It was a way you could write off some of your tax money against the making of a film. But they had really, really, really cracked down on this. So Rafe was taking his money. So he was investing in the film as well. Like, he was investing his own time and his own fees and so on. But of course, he was also using some of the money he'd earned from things like Clash of the Titans. And particularly, he was using his tax credits to do it. So in these tax schemes, you have to prove that they really tightened on this. You have to prove that you are a sole trader, that you are the person that you're putting your money in, and you're fundamentally part of whatever it is you're doing. That's
Mhm.
why a lot of the schemes collapsed, because if a guy's made a lot of tax, it owes a lot of tax, and he makes widgets or whatever, you can't prove that he's really involved in making a film like Coriolanus.
Right.
Rafe put his money in, and he was absolutely fine, but it needed something else. And the other person that put their tax money in was the singer, Will Young. If you remember him, he's still around, I think.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
he put his money in as well as part of the investment, and he had to prove that he was involved in the film in some way. So he made a documentary about it, which I don't know whether it's ever surfaced or not, but he was there to make a documentary. But actually, he was a bit worried that this was going to be enough. So at one point, we we had him as the news reporter that was gonna run through the film. It was not a success. He did his first thing, which is when the Volscians were invading, and it was not very convincing.
Oh
So
dear.
we
Well,
do
it's
that.
diving in the deep end, isn't it? You
Yeah,
know?
oh, no, he was so adorable. Anyway, he was fine in the end. His documentary was fine. But what it meant was we didn't have a news reporter, and that's when we went to Jon Snow from Channel 4 News to do it. And he was brilliant.
Yeah, I
I think he
love
was
those
absolutely
scenes.
brilliant. And he just delivered the lines as a Channel 4 news reporter. It
It
was
worked so well. I was like, how is this working so well? You know,
yeah,
it was
yeah,
extraordinary.
no, he was fantastic. So that was the finance and that was we put together this. We had great younger people, enthusiastic people doing. We had like local Serbian costume designer. We had a lovely production designer from London who I worked with briefly on a very small film, and he was just, people were just full of passion for what they were doing, which I love about doing a film of this kind that pulled it together. But we didn't have very much money to offer to the actors. So again, we were very, very reliant on the goodwill of these people.
Yeah.
So Brian Cox and Vanessa Redgrave and Jessica Chastain as the three sort of principals in a way, alongside with Rafe, um, agreed to do it for a favoured nation amount of money, which was not a lot of money. And then other actors would not paid a lot, but something like Jimmy Nesbitt was thrilled to be doing something like this. It was very high end. But what we felt we needed was we perhaps needed, if we were going to get distribution in America, because there was nothing. We've got distribution in the UK, the BBC are involved. We'd got this money from Serbia, we'd got the tax credit money, and we'd got the money that Rafe was putting in himself. But we hadn't got any distribution going in. We got the sales company Icon was selling it, but they it struggled to sell it. So we had this notion of going to Jerry Butler, who
Great.
worked with him on, trying to remember what the connection, the connectivity was. But anyway, Jerry was really thrilled to do it because he's never offered anything like this. He basically is always going to be a girt, strong man knocking people about or whatever. And he's a much better actor than that. But that's what all comedies, romantic comedies. So he was thrilled to
Mm.
be offered this part. And particularly as he had started out as a lawyer's assistant, and he was actually helping out he was driving a casting director around in Scotland, and she was kind of obviously gorgeous. And she says to him, "Have you ever thought about acting?" And he goes, "But acting?" And she goes, "Yeah, acting. Look, I could probably put you up some things." Anyway, she put him up for a production of Coriolanus,
Oh,
directed by
wow,
Stephen
wow.
Boycott, and he played a spear carrier. So that was the very first thing he'd ever done.
What a
And here he
coincidence.
is
Yeah.
being offered Tullus Ophidius as, the second lead in the film. So we had more money than we had for the others, but not a lot more, not a lot more. And he could only come in at the very last minute. So the production was quite strange because we didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't pay for people to come over and do that. So the scheduling of the film had to be around their other commitments, which
Mm.
meant was actually turned out to be a very good thing in a way. First of all, we went to Serbia and we didn't have the deal signed. And Rafe took an incredible chance and said, "Look, if I don't do this now, the whole thing might fall apart. So I'm going to pay for a few weeks while we get the
Wow.
final things of the
Amazing.
production signed and done." But what it meant was, because people weren't available, we did a lot of recces and we did a lot of technical recces. It was probably the best prepared film I've ever worked on in my life. And then, because we couldn't shoot anything else, we shot the Battle of Coriolanus as the very first thing we did.
Oh
We
gosh.
I've got a version of it on a DVD, which is like half an hour, and it's really brilliantly worked out with a couple of really great stunt people and action coordinators. And Rafe did a magnificent job on that. And we then had to drop in the shots of Jerry Butler later on
Oh,
to do that.
interesting.
But it meant that we had a really strong sense of bonding for the whole company to shoot this sequence, and then we could go, as people were available, we could start going into shooting with them.
How long would you say, estimate like the pre-production phase, and how long was the shooting?
Right. Well, the pre-production was effective. I mean, if you include time spent trying to raise the money for it. That was several years that he was trying to pull that together. We didn't have, oh gosh, I should have checked the schedule on it. We didn't have a lot of time for shooting. I mean, because again, time is money, and so we had to get through a lot in a relatively short period of time. So I think we were probably prepping for about 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. 6 weeks maybe. We were kind of like we were kind of slightly stuck because there was only so much we could do. It was very interesting again because Rafe was so meticulous about things. So, for example, we had a very brilliant, I thought, a really good Serbian costume designer, but Rafe was very unhappy with the dress military uniforms, particularly things that he as Coriolanus would wear. And this is kind of, I love this kind of attention to detail, that he just felt like it looked, they made them, but they didn't look right to him. And he actually flew in a military tailor, and the military tailor gave us this extraordinary masterclass in how it's all smoke and mirrors, because the uniforms are constructed in a way, of course, to make you look super butch and macho and all that. So they're tailored and cut in odd ways to because they're designed to fit very snugly in certain areas and less snugly, and less so in other things. And the cut has to be so. So that's why when you see like dress, so the military uniforms look amazing when you see kind of like the kind of a platoon lined up in their best dress uniforms or whatever, or the generals or the commanders or whatever. And now I know why, because it is a very specific thing. It's not just general tailoring. So his attention to detail on things like that was fabulous. And as I say, we were stuck waiting for actors because we didn't have the money to just buy them out for the whole time of the shoot, which I think was something like 6 weeks, 6 weeks or 7 weeks. It's very little, it's like a normal kind of amount of time for a lowish budget film. We also had to, so we had this time where we did a lot of technical preps. We maybe did 3 technical recces where you'd often just do one, which meant that Rafe was really clear in his head when we did, for example, do the Battle of Coriolanus, which in the film is only about 3 minutes or something. And as I say, we shot about 25 minutes. But it was very accurately done. And what I really liked was also the determination was to go for reality as much as we could. So the editor who I brought onto the film, Nicholas Gasto, is a very fine editor who works particularly well with new people. He's very good at guiding people when they're less familiar, and he's worked on a number of terrific films with first-time directors, and he was perfect for this. And he also kind of helped out a bit when it came to that battle, that he shot a few bits of it almost like a second unit. But we wanted that sense that you got when you see newsreel footage of like ordinary people caught in the middle of this, that suddenly there's a dead body and there's a couple of in overcoats running across a street, or an old lady with there's one beautiful shot of an old lady looking out of the balcony watching what we were filming, and it's fabulous. She's just got this quality of because she was real, that this was street fighting, and it was done in a very realistic manner.
Wow.
Which I might say was one of the things I liked about the film, that we had it's basically, there's the military police are called the Psy, and they were, I mean, quite honestly, goodness knows what they were doing during the war there. I would hate to think they were very much a Christian militia, and that when kind of there was fighting going on between Serbians, say, and Bosnians, many of whom are Muslims, you realize when you're in the country, there's this unbelievable deep-seated feeling of what happened between the Muslims and the Christians since like I don't know, 12th century or 15th century or whatever. So that sort of hung in the air. But anyway, they were kind of uber efficient soldiers. But one of them in particular, we took as our sort of military advisor on the film, and he made sure that all that street fighting was correct, and that when they enter the building, and when they enter the building, and that was the other thing of shooting in Serbia was it's pretty amazing. I'm told to some extent it's still there, but certainly in 2010 it was the case that you would go to a hotel and the front of the hotel would be there in Belgrade, but the back of the hotel had been destroyed during the war,
Gosh.
and it was just left like that. So it was perfect for us. So we had these buildings where you could go through and had these incredible locations to shoot in. So we were shooting the kind of the entry of Gaius Marcius is leading his troops in, and he takes them up the stairs, and the smoke clears, and there's the Volscas, and there's Tullus Ophidius waiting, and of course in the play, which is set in Rome, that they get their swords out and they have a sword fight. So Rafe and John had decided that they would have a knife fight. So as we started to choreograph this sequence, we get up the stairs and they have their exchange where they say how much they hate each other or whatever, and then they put their guns down on the floor and get their knives out. And our military advisor was going absolutely berserk and going, "Well, wait, no, you don't." And Rafe is trying to explain. He said, "Look, this is it is Shakespeare, and this is what we had in Shakespeare, and this is what we're doing." And this guy is just looking and he goes, "Oh, he's movie. I understand."
Oh. That's so funny.
And again, we had limited, we always had limited time and limited, but we were extremely well prepared to do these things. We had very good stunt coordinators, and you don't have a lot of money, so you can't put on a spectacular thing. I think we did very well for the
Yeah.
money that we had, thanks to the Serbian government giving us tanks, weapons, all these kind of things. But the knife fight, we wanted to have something spectacular at the end, so we came up with that idea. Again, it's Rafe and John working on this, came up with the idea that they grapple and then they go through the plate glass window together and they're dragged away by their respective sides, which I think was really very effective. And one of those moments that when I think about it now makes me feel queasy because, we did what we could with the money. So we had health and safety, we were doing it, but we're still basically two stuntmen are going to fly out the window onto a lot of
Yeah.
cardboard boxes from quite a height. And there was a moment where they're just lying there, and you're thinking, God, I hope we did. Did we have enough money for the extra cardboard boxes that we did? Yes, we did. So we just winded.
Oh,
But
wow. Yeah, that like as a producer, that must feel so, you must feel like such a responsibility for everything. So it must make you
you
feel like,
you constantly do. The other spectacular gag, as they call them, was when they're searching the bus that's been wired up with a bomb, and that great shot of the two guys coming out of the bus and being blown away by it while the troops are waiting elsewhere. That was hairy too.
yeah, anytime I see explosions in films and stuff, I'm always like, oh, it's, because it's so, I mean, it's a controlled explosion. It's very dangerous. So,
We are, and that particularly. Oh, then that's the standards in different countries are quite variable. So when we started, but when the Battle of Coriolis starts, of course it's a war-torn street with smoke pouring out of it. So we arrive on the set. Go, God, what's that smell? It's unbelievable, burning rubber. I mean, I haven't smelled anything like this for years. And literally, it's burning tires, which you would never be allowed to do in the West anymore.
no.
And but that was what they had to create the burning things. I mean, high toxicity
Wow.
of the stuff. And I said to the second assistant director, who's a hilarious character, I said to him, "Are you allowed to do this?" He kind of goes, "Are we allowed to do it?" He said, "This, have you smelt the air in Belgrade in normal circumstances? This is like a cool mountain breeze blowing."
Dear. This is actually an
And
upgrade.
and of course, they were used to shooting. They'd done quite a lot of war films in when it was Yugoslavia. It was a big location for that. And one of the films they shot there is, I think, is a film that I love, Sam Peckinpah's film Cross of Iron, which is obviously set on the German front lines or whatever. But it's like a Russia, it's German Russia. No, it's as they're going into Russia. That's right. But there's a little boy in the film. He's a Russian boy who gets taken by the Germans, and he's taken into the trenches, and he becomes almost like a mascot to them. And that little boy is in Coriolanus. He's like Rafe's number 2 in the platoon. And it was like, that was incredible, these sort of connective things that happen on the film. Obviously, for me, I'm a film buff, so anything like that is a really wonderful thing.
I just want to jump a little bit back and ask about rehearsals. Like, did you guys have time to do rehearsals? Wow.
It was impossible because, I mean, I think Rafe sat down. Because again, once you pull the people together, they're all busy on other projects. So there was certainly no time to put, like, the ideal world, you would have had like 1 or 2 weeks where you would sit and do that. No way. That people would arrive, and then that Rafe would sit with them and start going over the material that needed to be gone over. I think he might have had tiny bit of time. I think because Vanessa had been on it for a long time with the idea of her playing Bologna. So she was, I think they'd kind of, gone through stuff or whatever. I think he'd had a little bit of that with Jessica Chastain, but essentially, they had to kind of figure it out when they were there. There was so little time to do that. But of course, you're dealing with supreme professionals. The issue primarily, I guess, would be that Vanessa was magnificent, but her memory is not what it was. So she was absolutely fantastic, and she worked very hard with Joan Washington, even though she's a brilliant, Shakespearean actress. But it was challenging because there's that. Rafe is just extraordinary. He knew his own part and everybody's part. He knew the entire play. He knew the uncut text. He knew what had been taken out. He knew what was in this. And so he was kind of, but he's also having to act as well as set the cameras up and decide what to do with. So it's very, very tricky. She was magnificent, but her performances pieced together to some degree because she just couldn't remember the lines sometimes, and so that was something that was a practical issue to deal with, but was dealt with. And of course, she's magnificent, I think, in the film.
Absolutely incredible. And she has what we talked about earlier, just this like sense of, naturalness, and it just like comes from her soul, and it's just so perfect. And I was like, whoa. It's like,
and she loves Rafe and really loved him, loves him, and that you felt that connection and you could really believe. And again, like, right, so Battle of Coriolanus done, like, unbelievably difficult sequence to start with, but we did it. And then Vanessa arrives, and we're into the stuff with her, and then Brian Cox turns up. And Brian's fantastic. He was just, so he came on the set and he watched, and it's the scene in the bathroom where she's dressing Coriolanus's wounds and so on. Fantastic scene between her and Rafe. And Brian sat with me at the monitor, and he was just kind of staring and staring and staring or whatever. And I said, so how do you feel about all this, Brian? And he said, I'm bricking myself. He said, I've done Shakespeare for years, but he said, it's great that I arrived today because I'm going to do what she's doing.
That's great.
I think he's absolutely magnificent as Menenius. It's such an interesting role because he's sympathetic to Coriolanus, and he recognizes that the mother is pushing him into this thing, but he also wants it. All these people around. I mean, it's a tragedy because Coriolanus is a bloke that likes, killing people and restoring order by, martial order and all that stuff. And the idea of trying to be a politician and what a politician does, and that Brian is really trying to help him, mold him into that. So when he goes to the market and gives the speech to the people, and I always find it heartbreaking for Coriolanus because he's really trying very hard to be this politician, but he's struggling, and he's got the support of Menenius, but it's still tough. And then what follows that, because this is the biggest thing I would say about any of these things, is Shakespeare is so extraordinary about human behavior. And he puts things in which people kind of almost can't quite, not everybody gets it, particularly in a film form. On a stage, you kind of somehow accept it. On a film, there's a slightly different thing that obtains. And that what happens in that scene when he's pushed for the first time, he's out of military uniform, he's wearing a suit, uh, Coriolanus, and he's saying to the people, "I'm going to be your champion, and vote for me, and everything will be great." And then the two tribunes step forward, and they turn the crowd around completely, absolutely. And I've had people say to me, "Oh, well, that's so abrupt that they get turned around like that." I say, "Have you actually ever been to a political meeting?" You need is one good orator, and he'll turn the whole he'll turn the room around. It's like I watched lectures on Brexit. I remember going to a debate about Brexit at the London Palladium before it happened, and there was people like Nick Clegg, the Liberal leader, who was, he was quite convincing. There were some Tory people there, and there was a gentleman called Nigel Farage, who I think is hideous. But my God, he turned the room round in seconds. From, you probably had a room that was basically pro-European, wanted to keep it, and he just was so sharp and smart and lethal and all those things. So Shakespeare recognized his understanding of human psychology is so
It's extraordinary.
astounding. And that sense that this boy is being, because he is a boy, is being pushed into something that's completely wrong and is not going to work out for him. And the way that that is then treated by the people, and again, of course, that everything goes completely pear-shaped when he's in the television studio and he gets wound up by the audience and loses it. He does it like Donald Trump the other day. He's just kind of completely loses it and just kind of loses everyone and the city that's betrayed him. But that's so powerful. The other thing is just language. Is just like how, like Joan. I was always sitting with Joan at the monitor. We always like it was such a joy. My God, you sit. Can't tell you how much I miss her. Uh, the language of like, "You Titan of the minnows." I mean, like,
Yeah.
what a brilliant line! It's full of lines, and the perception of people, and the way that things can change in language, and the understanding within language is so stunning. There was never a moment of any time where I kind of felt this is kind of not relevant to today. I thought everything that happens in that play is incredibly relevant to today.
Absolutely. I thought, yeah, that's what I was sort of with the news and stuff. It's amazing how something from, 400 years can then just fit so seamlessly into the modern, like you said, like Shakespeare's plays are timeless, quite eerie in a way that it just fits.
Well, because I mean, it's like with it is every single play is really nothing changes. I mean, yes, the costumes change and the kind of the times change, but essentially the bottom line in the whole thing is that human behavior is fairly consistent, and the fallibility of humans, and the fact that, like, what a character he is, Gaius Marcius, that he is kind of like, he's a bit pathetic on one level. He's mummy's boy on one level. He's a bully. He's all those things. But then there's also a dignity, and there's also a side to him that he's trying to reconcile these things. And his mother, in the end, really destroys him by forcing him to become a politician. And then she kind of goes in and destroys him at the end, effectively.
I always think Shakespeare does like characters so well because he's not afraid to put the good and the bad in them, It's just like the anti-hero, and you see it's not just like, oh, superhero, It's like,
Great. It's constantly great. And the only thing we did do, which is a bit naughty, but we did it, is that we did actually give Menenius a payoff, because in the play you just hear that he committed suicide, and we showed it, and we didn't write God Shakespearean dialogue for him doing it. But we just had that moment where Brian goes and sits by the riverside, and he takes his watch off and he slits his wrists, and then you see him slumped and he's dead. And I think it's really a fantastic moment. And I think, yes, we added it, but I think it was something that really gave the story, it gave his character a resolution, and it was which it gets in the play, but it was just one other thing. He's such a powerful presence, and he was so magnificent throughout the film.
yeah. And I think that's, that's really great that you guys did that, because you are adapting, a play that was on stage for a film. So adding things visually, and it makes absolute sense that you would do that.
Well, we
So
looked at, I mean, obviously I've grown up with a lot of Shakespearean films, but Rafe and I watched a lot of Shakespeare together. And of course, it goes from things like Henry V, the Olivier film, which of course is brilliant in its own way, that it starts in the theatre. You actually are on stage in a theatre, and the play is gradually opening up until you're on the fields of Agincourt, and then it comes back into more of a theatrical setting. So that's audacious, the way that he chose to do that. It's so brilliantly done. Um, I have a lot of Shakespearean films that I love for what they do. I love the Polanski Macbeth, not because of the verse speaking, which I think is a bit rudimentary, but it just has, because Polanski is an incredible filmmaker, and he was working with Gil Taylor, one of the all-time great cinematographers, and the film has an incredible atmosphere and feeling for that. There's the one of the finest ever, in my opinion, is the Russian Hamlet, which is absolutely
I don't
extraordinary.
think
So
I've
you've
seen
got
that,
here,
actually.
oh,
Yeah.
it's amazing. It was made in like 1964. It's shot in scope, black and white scope, and it is like, it's so visually stunning, because the Elsinore is like presented as this really extraordinary place where these events happen. The ghost of the father is like this huge figure with the cloak flying out behind him, the sea smashing against the walls and so on. It's
I'm gonna watch it.
extraordinary atmosphere. Throne of Blood, the Kurosawa version of Hamlet, which is of Macbeth, which is set in medieval Japan. That's, you could you. It's incredible how, of course, you lose the beauty of the language, but what you keep is the psychology of it, and you also, great filmmakers find a way to mine it. We looked at a lot of stuff. The film that Rafe was blown away by and he'd never seen was the film that Peter Brook made of King Lear with Paul Schofield, which was a very famous stage production. It's like 1970, and it's shot in very grainy black and white, and it's very simple. It's very much about the performances rather than anything else. And Rafe was really blown away by that. He said that was the one that, out of everything that we looked at, that really left this impression on him. And he said, that he wanted something that somehow was, I think that was the biggest inspiration. So
Wow.
he had worked with a great cinematographer called Barry Ackroyd, who started out working a lot with Ken Loach and British sort of social realist cinema. And Barry shot The Hurt Locker, which Rafe was in, and they bonded very closely. And he watched the way that Barry worked and operated. And Barry, quite often on a film, people who don't know, there's the cinematographer, lighting cameraman, as they call them, and then there's like the camera operator. And that when films were heavily unionized, there was no way that the lighting cameraman or the cinematographer could actually operate the camera himself. He had to. He worked with his gaffer. He set up the lights, and he would direct where the light was coming from, and the operator would then take the camera and operate it, and that would be the thing. But increasingly, I mean, it often happened in the past, people could get away with it, and increasingly the cinematographer now is also the operator too. And it's obviously very intimate when you're shooting a film and you're operating and you're right there with the actors. And the approach that Rafe loved of Barry's that he'd seen on The Hurt Locker was, he said he almost approached it like a documentary. That's what he wanted with Coriolanus. If you look at the film, there's very few fancy camera setups. What it's mostly is recording what's going on in a very direct way. And it was that notion that this, when they went into a scene, like, for example, when he goes from being Gaius Marcius, but he's now named Coriolanus after he's won the Battle of Coriolis, and the camera goes up the steps to see him, and then it goes into this hall, and there's his mother, and there's his wife, and all that stuff. And that scene, out of it, I mean, this was true of everything, but literally, when they were blocking the camera moves, all that Rafe would say to Barry was, "How would you cover this if you were doing this for the BBC?" What would you do if you were doing this for as a documentary or as a TV news report? And it's a very different mindset because you're not thinking about the camera being working as some separate, distinct thing. It's kind of like it's rough and raw, and it also fits in again with the footage that we shot of kind of it wasn't hugely shaky cam as they call it,
Yeah, I sort of did notice that. I was like, "Oh,
no,
it's a little, like a little," but
there's a
no.
little element to that, but we didn't overdo that. But it does give you that ability. It was shot on film, and we could have shot it digitally, and it would have been a lot easier to shoot digitally in some ways because you're not worrying about the camera reels running out. But what we did was we shot with film that you could put twice as much film into the camera. It's technically it's 2 perforation film rather than 4 perforation film or 3 perforation film, and it just meant that you could put more film into the that you load onto the camera. So it meant that we had more to work with. I'm really grateful that we didn't shoot digitally because it was hard enough as it was. We actually shot every now and again we shot with 2 cameras, which you'd think, oh, well, that's great because that's saving time. And some directors like to do that. Ridley Scott likes to shoot with like 10 cameras or something. But for most people, to be honest, it's quite hard because you've got so much material to choose from, and you're not really making the hard decisions up front, which is to shoot this way and then reverse and shoot that way. And in some sense, you're figuring out things in advance as you shoot that. If you're just squirting off film, to me, it always feels like a bit of a mistake. So we did shoot with 2 cameras, and we did have a lot of material, and it was a chore in post-production to do that. I'd rather that we'd really shot everything just on a single camera and done separate setups and so on. Anyway, but Barry is very much that's what he does, and he does this, by the way, on big Hollywood films. That he shot that great film, The Big Short,
Oh, yeah.
and Steve Carell was talking about the experience of it at a kind of a event I went to, and somebody asked him about working with Barry, who's kind of not a conventional Hollywood cameraman, and he said, "Yeah, too right, he's not." He said that often you would be giving your what you felt was the great moment. You've nailed it, you've got it, and you look over and Barry's shooting some oranges in a bowl on the
Oh, gosh.
he thought the moment was more interesting like that. But he has that sounds random, but it wasn't because there would have been a reason why he was doing that. But you get something really special and unique. I'd worked with him years before. I did a film with him years and years and years ago called The Lost Son. But this was only the second time I worked with him, and it was just a privilege to work with someone who's so brilliant and talented. But again, it was a great privilege to work with all the people on this film because everyone was loving what we were doing, and they were very committed to Rafe's vision. And people knew without being told that he basically had put all his own, he wasn't taking
Yeah.
a penny for doing it. This was something that was ripped from his soul. And for me, it was a very beautiful experience because I had got him out the Royal Shakespeare Company to do his first full
Amazing.
thing, and which I produced as with him as he's making his debut as an actor in a full length film. And then whatever it was, 10 years later, no, when was it? 20 years later. 20 years later, I was producing the first thing that or co-producing the first film that he was directing. So it was it felt very special because of
That's
that.
that's fantastic. I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give for filmmakers who are thinking to make a Shakespeare film? I know this is probably super broad, but you know.
Very broad. I mean, I think be true to yourself. Like Polonius says that you've got to be truthful to what it is. I think so. For example, Bernard Rose, friend of mine, I think really wonderful director, is doing King Lear at the moment with Al Pacino, and I think that's a contemporary version of it. And he's assembled the most magnificent cast, including I think Jessica Chastain to be in it. And it will be, Bernard has got a particular vision. It's tough. His stuff is always tough and energetic and all those things. So I know it will be something distinct. When Polanski said he was going to do Macbeth, you knew there was going to be a vision behind it. And when the version I mentioned earlier, the Michael Almereyda Hamlet, Michael Almereyda is a brilliant independent American director, and he shot this as a small American indie film where the whole thing of Denmark is like it's a corporation rather than a country, and that there's, you know, he just found ways that made it really work without being gimmicky. And I think that avoiding gimmicks is absolutely essential, and really we were on the cusp, I think, with kind of when you set it in the way that we set it. We made one change at the end, which I really wish we hadn't, which was it ends at the moment on Coriolanus being dumped after he's been killed by Ophidius. And after that, there was a sequence where people gathered around with iPhones, with camera phones, and took pictures of it. And we decided that it was like, it felt a bit unbelievable and a bit too much, and we just left it as it was. So it's still powerful that you have the mother watching this on television and she sees her son's dead body. But literally, after we'd locked the film and done anything, I think it was Gaddafi or whoever, or one of them, that the footage emerged, and there's all these people with camera phones phone your body. So it felt like that when we saw it, we said, "Oh, we could justify it," but actually, maybe it would have come across as something a little bit gimmicky. But
Maybe, and phones don't do well in films, you know, because they evolve so fast that
well,
it's
they
sort of
do. We've got Menenius on a BlackBerry in Coriolanus, so you prove your point there. What's that, Mum? What's he doing?
I know, it's so funny with
No,
phone.
I think it's got to be. I think it's authenticity, which is my only cri de coeur on any project. Is you've got to be authentic to your own vision and to your own feelings. And I would say, because I probably shouldn't talk about the ones I don't like. There have been several recent Shakespearean films, and I thought that they were more about the ego of the person doing it than anything else. And I think that the verse speaking, oh my God, there's one in particular which I won't go into, but there's what the verse speaking is so bad in some of the films, and I do think that that is a joke. You can't do Shakespeare without some thought to it, and I think we were really spoilt by having Joan Washington, who was just a magnificent person for verse speaking.
I'm a filmmaker and I was just absorbing everything, and it was just, it's incredible, I think, because you know what you did was you got it done, you know, no matter what, like you said, you know, and
Well, it
that's what
was
filmmakers need to hear, that you can do it. So
No, it was very, very tough. I mean, the music is a whole other area in the film that's interesting to talk about. My friend Elan Eshkari, I brought into the music, and at first he had a more conventional idea of what to do, and Rafe was very inspired. That was another film that was a big inspiration for him, called The Battle of Algiers, the Pontecorvo film about the Algerian French Civil War. Well, not Civil War, but the war in Algiers, where the French were trying to keep control of the country. And Ennio Morricone did the music, but it's very limited, his music. Most of it is the sound of women ululating on the street and things like that. And Rafe wanted something where the music was not conventional, where it was more sounds and atmosphere. And that was a very big part, I think, of the success of the film, was having this quite unique score that Elan did.
that's also amazing thing, but it's really that was really great, and thank you, you gave so much, I think, because it's a big challenge.
It was a tough film. It's a film I love a great deal, but it was a very, very, very tough shoot. To do it with as little money as we had was really challenging, but
Yeah.
everyone goes to it, and I think that the film has a great shelf life, like these films do, when it's well done in that way.
Thank you so much, Colin. This is really, really inspirational and informative, and I really appreciate your time. I'm sure everyone's going to learn a lot from the process you went through. And again, it's just a fantastic, amazing film.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome.
You've been listening to Stepping into Shakespeare, interview with Colin Vaines. Thank you to our sponsors, Precious Time Development Centres.